Hello everyone. In this video we're going to continue with our 3D Studio Max beginner series, and we're going to cover cameras and basic lighting, so we're going to jump right in. Last video we covered basic materials, and we're getting close to the end of this series. Today we're going to cover basic lighting and cameras, and then in the next video, which should be the last video series, is going to be rendering. So we're getting close, and hopefully you're getting a lot out of these basic videos, but come back and see our intermediate and advanced videos on 3D Studio Max, and it will get into a lot more deeper topics in Max. Alright, for this video, for this lesson, I'm going to just create some simple objects to set our cameras to and set our lighting to. So I'm just going to create a box, and this is a good way to test lighting and cameras using this setup, and I'll show you how to do this. Creating a box, it's a fairly good size box. Doesn't have to be any specific size, but there it is. And on that box I'm going to put a modifier called normal. So find the normal modifier, and what this does is it flips the normals on an object in Max. And what the normals are, let me turn this flip normals back off. And what the normals are the actual polygons that you're seeing in the viewport. Now on the other side of these polygons, there's no color value, there's no graphic value. And in previous versions of Max, the back side of the normals would show up transparent. They've changed that in these newer versions to where the back side of the normal is black. So that kind of gives you a better idea of whenever you're importing objects. Sometimes the normals will be flipped around, and so when you import something and the normals were flipped inside out in the past, it would just be transparent and you wouldn't know if there was anything there. But now you can actually see the back side of the normals, which is black now. So you can always go in and change that setting by right clicking on your object, going to object properties, and back face cull is what you would want to set to reset that normals for transparency. Alright, so I'm going to flip normals on this, and so now the normals are flipped to the inside of this box. Shadows and lighting here. There we go. I'll turn that back on here in just a minute, but as you can see, the normals are now flipped to the inside of this box. So now all the color value, the graphic value, is on the inside and not the outside. Alright, and I'm going to set up a camera here. So an easy way to set your camera up is the way I like to do it is in your perspective viewport. You get your view set up the way you would like to see your camera set, and then just Control C, and then you can see it creates that camera from that view. And now up in the left hand corner, upper left hand corner, you can see my view has changed from perspective to camera 01. So also, if you'll notice down in the bottom right hand corner, these viewport settings or viewport tools have changed a little bit from perspective to a camera. And so if I go into a front viewport, I get a few different viewport tools than if I'm in a camera viewport. And this gives you a few more tools to work with your camera in a viewport, things like dolly and field of view and perspective. So you can play around with those, kind of stretch out and use your field of view to kind of get a good long range perspective. And this also changes your lens and field of view settings on your camera. So you can see whenever I go here and change the field of view in the viewport, you can see it changing the lens and field of view settings on the actual camera. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and put a teapot in here, just something to have in the viewport, having the scene that we can focus on. Now always remember that any type of panning or zooming that you now do in this viewport will affect that camera. So a lot of times if you're used to working in a perspective viewport and then you create a camera from that viewport and then it changes that viewport to a camera view, whenever people sometimes forget and go in and start panning and try to do modeling here in this viewport, and not knowing that they're moving their camera around and transforming their camera. So be mindful of that. If you want to go in and make some adjustments to your scene or model, you can always go and hit P on your keyboard, which changes that back to a perspective view, and now you're out of that camera. And then when you want to go back to your camera, just hit C and it jumps back into your camera view. Alright, so let's look at some of these settings for our camera. So I'll select our camera and go to the Modify tab. And you can see that you have your lens settings, and your lens and field of view settings are sort of linked together, so you can't really change one without changing the other. You have an orthographic projection, which takes all the perspective out of the view. Kind of sets it to where I can't see my teapot because everything is a straight line projection, orthographic. And then you have stock lenses here that you can just toggle through if you know what you want your lens size to be, and it's a stock lens, should be here in this list. Alright, this next section is your type of camera. You have two types, a free camera and a target camera. By default, whenever you use the Control C option, it creates a target camera. And what a target camera is a camera that has the target part, which is here, and the camera part, which is here. You can select both parts of the camera by clicking in the middle between the target and the camera. If you click on this line here, you can move all of it together. Or if you select a camera, you can see you move it independently of your target and move your target independently of your camera. Now this is helpful whenever you're doing animating and you want to do some panning around on a focus object in an animation, but you want to keep that focus on the object as the camera moves around. This is an easy way to do it. Just put your target where your object is and then animate this camera. You can also put this camera on a path just by using a simple line and using your follow path controller, have this camera follow a path. Alright, and with a free camera, of course, it takes out the target, so whenever you move this camera there's no target. It moves it as one rigid object. So I'm going to go back and say target camera, show cone. This cone shows the field of view of this particular camera, but as soon as I click off of it without the show cone turned on, that cone goes away. Sometimes you'll want to see that cone constantly in the viewport, so you'll know if you move your object out of the field of view of that camera, you'll know where that is here. And then show horizon. This box wasn't here and I turn that show horizon on, you would see the horizon line in the background. So this shows you exactly where your horizon is. Alright, so I'm going to turn that back off. And let's see, environmental ranges. This is all the settings for things like volumetric fog in the viewport. This sets the ranges for that fog to be clipped by this camera. This group here, clipping planes, is another clipping option. If you wanted to clip objects in the scene, you can see here this actually clips what's seen by that camera in that camera view. And this is good to use if you have a lot of objects in your scene and you're trying to focus on one object. It sort of cuts everything else out of the equation in the viewport. Of course, it doesn't get rid of the objects in the viewport, it just clips those objects from this camera. And then you have a multi-pass effect. This camera can do things like a depth of field. If you click on that, enable it, and wherever your target is set, that will be the focus point for your depth of field. You can click on preview. It's not going to be much here because this is it's not really a lot to look at graphically in this viewport. So let me put a texture on this box here, make it a little more interesting, and maybe just a simple texture on my teapot. So now when we select that camera and use our preview and our depth of field, and you can see a little bit of a change. If we go down here and turn this sample radius up a good bit, now you can see it changes pretty good. And what it does is blur the background or blur the everything around that focal point, which is our teapot. Let me turn that back down just a bit here. So this gives you a good preview of what a depth of field would look like on this object. And we're going to cover depth of view a little more, especially when we get into mental ray, because mental ray, as you can see here in this drop down, has its own depth of field setting, and does have a few more bells and whistles than this regular depth of field does. That's basically just the basics of cameras. It's not much more than that. So I'm going to go ahead and start on lighting. And I'm going to throw just a simple light in this viewport. Coincidentally, your lights and cameras can be found in the Create tab. Of course, your third button is lights, fourth button is cameras. There's your target and your free if you wanted to create them directly from this Create tab. If you wanted to create a target camera, you click on where you want your camera and you then drag where you want your target. If you wanted to create a free camera, you just click in the viewport and there's your free camera. Alright, so lights. We basically have three types of lights. You have an omni, a direct, and a spot. And then you have different variations of those. You have a target spot, a target direct, and then your omni, which is an omnidirectional light. You can also change between those lights in the Modify tab. So if you have your light selected, you go to the Modify tab and you have a drop down list here if I can change between a spotlight, a directional light, or an omni light. And then of course the parameters change for each lighting, but there are some common parameters for each light. So I'm going to just cover the basic parameters for some of these lights. The light type we just covered, the light is on or off. And let me copy this light over so we can get a little more depth here. And you copy lights just like any other object. I'm holding shift down and using the move tool. And you always have the option of copy, instance, or reference. I'm going to turn on shadows, and I'm also going to use my hardware rendering, and it makes it a little more interesting in the viewport. So you can do that by right-clicking here, lighting and shadows, and if you have a good graphics card, you can enable hardware shading and get your shadows and things like ambient occlusion in the viewport. So you know you have some specular highlights, some ambient occlusion, and so on. Turn this down just a bit. Alright, so this is kind of cool. When you turn on shadows in your viewport, it gets some nice shadow effects here. So I'm going to set it right there. Alright, shadows, of course, turn on shadows. Use global settings. This allows you to use settings set that for the global scene, so you can set all your lights with the same settings. You do that through Tools and Light Lister, so you can set your settings here. Alright, you can also change the different types of shadows that this light uses. Advanced Ray Trace and Ray Trace are used well with transparent objects, allowing light to pass through transparent objects. If you're just using this shadow map, it will not let light pass through any object, so it doesn't respect transparencies, but it does render a lot quicker than any of the others. So then you have your mental ray shadows used with the mental ray renderer, and then area shadows, which is kind of a soft shadow effect, and then again your ray trace shadows and advanced ray trace shadows. So I'm going to just shadow map for now. You also have the option of excluding and including objects from this light. You can set what this light illuminates or what it doesn't illuminate, and you can say I just want it to illuminate an object or allow that object to cast shadows, or vice versa. And then the intensity color attenuation, this is probably the most important rollout of lights. There's your multiplier, which sets the intensity for that light, the light color, and then we get into decay. If your light is way too bright, you can set in some different types of decay, like inverse and inverse square, which is just twice the inverse. So this kind of clamps the light a little bit, and sort of a preset. And then it's a real quick way to pull back your lighting. And you can see here you have a sort of a fall off. You can see in the viewport, you get this round gizmo around your light, and this is where your light starts falling off from this point on. So your light is full intensity to here to there, and then it starts falling off. So you can tell it to show that all the time. But if you don't want to use a preset decay, you can also use far or near attenuation. Near attenuation is going to attenuate the light from the light to this point and then again out. So you have a start and an end. Okay, let me turn this grid off. So again, you're with near attenuation, you get no light here, then light, and then light falls off again, so you get this sort of a halo effect. Far attenuation is usually what we use for attenuating lights. You have a start value and an end value, just like with the near attenuation. As you can see, The light is full in effect from here to there, which is your start, and then from here to this outer ring is where it starts falling off, and then after that outer ring the light is non-existent. So this allows you to really control your lights with a good easy graphic to see. You can see if those 2 points become real close together, you get a really hard fall off there. And just a note, lighting is one of the, in my opinion, one of the hardest things to learn in 3D. And it takes years of practice really to get to know how to use lighting correctly, and lots of studying on photometrics and photons, and lots of light calculations. So like I said, this is one of the most advanced parts of 3D, and especially in 3D Studio Max. So, but we're just going to cover the basics today. Alright, and I'm not going to get into advanced effects, shadow parameters. This has all the parameters for your shadows, things like color and density, how dense your shadow is, how well it works with that atmospheric effects, and so on. This will get you started on using lights and cameras, and then come back and we're going to really get into more advanced stuff with lights and cameras in the intermediate to advanced. So hope you enjoyed it, and come back and see us.